Good afternoon. We're going to start today's webinar. Thank you for calling in. My name is Steve Albert, and I'm the president of Allstate Appraisal. Appreciate everyone taking the time to call in today. Our webinar is entitled The Do's and Don'ts to Asking Compliant Rebuttal Questions, and a little bit more. I'm the president of Allstate Appraisal. As an appraiser, I recognize I'm developing and communicating my own personal opinion of value on properties that I appraise. I also recognize that sometimes my clients or other intended users of my appraisal services simply disagree or may find some concern regarding a description of a property that I've appraised in my appraisal. And they want to be able to convey those concerns to me directly or indirectly. Until recently, these types of concerns or requests for reconsiderations of value or rebuttals could reach me as an appraiser in an unfiltered manner. I'm sure every caller today on this webinar has a treasure trove of personal experiences regarding inappropriate requests for values from 2006 and 2007, even some recently. Today, there are regulations in place that help filter these types of communications to appraisers, not to muzzle those types of complaints, concerns, or observations from occurring, not whatsoever, but rather to impart some filtering or to ensure that those types of communications don't impact on appraiser independence. Today's webinar addresses on the more timely and more important components of this topic, but by no means are intended to be comprehensive. With me here today is Scott Sparks, our National Chief Appraiser, Justin Jennis, our National Operations Manager, Brandon Nappy, our Post-Completion Quality Control Manager, and Laura Parrish, our Compliance Officer. I venture to say that of this list of speakers, or at least those participating in the preparation of this webinar today, the two with the toughest job are our Compliance Officer and our Post-Completion QC Manager. Compliance is a moving target today, with 38 states and counting imposing regulation on AMCs, and with all of that type of regulation, including language addressing appraiser independence, you can imagine that your AMCs need to be on top of this every single day. The Post-Completion QC Manager addresses those complaints in the capacity of a screener to help ensure that those complaints or observations or requests are appropriate. Allstate Appraisal is an older company in the industry. We've been around a long time. For the 28 years that I've been working at Allstate, I've dealt with, either personally or indirectly, different types of appraiser pressure, complaints, communications from clients, and some of that has been inappropriate. Some of it reflects nothing more than a client's honest impression that we made an error in the report. Intended users of appraisals and clients are absolutely entitled to be able to voice their concerns regarding our work product. But the manner in which they do it today is heavily regulated. And the purpose of an AMC is to help make sure that those communications are appropriate. Part of the reason why I've included this particular slide is to show that our experience includes more than just lending institutions, but also the mortgage insurance industry, the GSEs, servicers, even the federal regulators, of course consumers. So we see these types of requests, or I should say we receive them, from all components of the lending and related industries. And they're consistent. Oftentimes the requests for reconsiderations of value or the requests for rebuttal are nothing more than an honest, integrity-driven communication. There's certainly instances in which they're not. Moving forward, Scott Sparks is going to take it from here, addressing the regulations in particular that I'm referring to. Scott?
Great. Thanks, Steve. And thanks, everybody, for joining our call today. I think we've got a lot of good information here. Just from looking at the people on the call here, it looks like we've got a lot of representation from the lender side, which is understandable, because I can appreciate some of the work that you guys go through every day and some of the frustrations that you have to deal with, not only from the borrower but from your loan officers, and just the frustrations all around an appraisal that may not come in as high as the borrower expected, especially from a sale price standpoint, or even for that matter, refi. So I understand that there's a lot of frustration in your daily adventures, or your daily workload that has to dealing with the loan officers and the borrowers. And certainly there are lots of mistakes that can be made in an appraisal that are definitely valid to go back and question. Appraisers aren't perfect. I think we all know that. As an appraiser myself, I know that I've made several errors in an appraisal, and certainly wanted to know about those and correct those whenever necessary. So jumping right into it, what we'll get into, obviously, the biggest thing here is the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines. We want to make sure that we're not violating anything that would be inside those guidelines to protect both the lender and the AMC. But as you know, interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines, they do offer a resolution of deficiencies. And as you can see on our PowerPoint here, it does talk about that. It says an institution should establish policies and procedures for resolving any inaccuracies or weaknesses in an appraisal or evaluation identified through the review process, including procedures for communicating the noted deficiencies to and request corrections of such deficiencies by the appraiser or the person who prepared the evaluation. An institution should implement adequate internal controls to ensure that such communications do not result in any coercion or undue influence on the appraiser or person who performed the evaluation. Again, Steve mentioned that at Allstate and probably many other AMCs, that takes the work of a qualified staff of appraisers to make sure that anything going to the appraiser doesn't violate this. So with that said, obviously moving on, 38 out of 50 states currently have AMC registration and licensing requirements, and I'm sure that's going to move to 50 very soon. And in all those states, it includes some rules that address appraiser independence. So definitely something that you're going to want a full-time compliance department to ensure that these guidelines are being met, and again, consistently, because they do change from time to time, and it is a moving target, just like Steve said, and that's why we have both a full-time compliance department and a full-time post-completion quality control department to make sure that the lender or even the AMC, for that matter, is not violating any part of the interagency appraisal evaluation guidelines. So moving on to the next page. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about appraiser independence and what it allows for. As you can see here, and we won't go over all this, obviously appraiser independence is very long, but what we're going to be focusing on today is down to number 3, which you can see is highlighted. What we don't want to do is we don't want to seek to influence an appraiser or otherwise to encourage a targeted value in order to facilitate the making or pricing of a transaction. However, with that said, as we mentioned, there are mistakes that happen, or there's appraisals, which all of us know, especially on the review side and the lender side, where appraiser hasn't done a very good job of supporting their value conclusion. So it does allow for exceptions, and it does allow for the appraiser to be questioned on possible mistakes within the appraisal report. As you see below here, number 1, it is allowable to send the appraiser additional appropriate property information, including the consideration of additional comparable properties to make or support an appraisal. Again, those would be your reconciliation values or your rebuttals. Number 2, it also goes on to say provide further detailed substantiation or explanation for the appraiser's value conclusion. And then number 3, obviously correct any errors in the appraisal report. I would say number 2 is probably the one that we see the most, is more just questioning the appraiser is, how did you come up with that value? You didn't put a whole lot of addendums in your appraisal report to explain exactly how you got to A. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that you've got a qualified team of QC individuals on your AMC. And at Allstate, and again, I'm going to go back to us just a little bit, we do have all of our reviewers get 100%, or all of our appraisals get 100% review by licensed appraisers. Again, we're hoping to catch some of these things before it ever gets delivered to you. That way, we make sure that the number of disputes and reconciliations are limited. So we're going to move on and really start diving into some of these requests and revisions. If you could come to the next slide. So making proper revisions and rebuttal requests. Again, your AMC partner should work with you to set up an acceptable policy and procedure around revision rebuttal requests to ensure that they're compliant with AIG along with USPAP. And again, the first thing I would recommend is setting up and establishing who is allowed to send over the request. Is it your underwriter, or a lot of lenders now are moving to collateral underwriting teams, so it would be hopefully one of those. Or even preferred would be an appraisal review department, that anytime a request for revisions needed, it gets requested by them. But the bottom line is your AMC should know exactly who's allowed to send over these requests. And then obviously when they're sending in additional comps to be considered, there should be some guidelines around how many comparables are allowed to be provided to the appraiser for additional commentary or consideration. Typically, what most of the lenders we work with, and what I recommended when I was back at my previous employer, was no more than 3 or 4. Again, sending an appraiser 25 sales that they printed off of, some website and just saying, have the appraiser address these. That's not fair to the appraiser. The appraiser's done a lot of work already and trying to choose the best comps available. Obviously, that's not to say that an appraiser may not have missed something, but definitely it should be limited to 3 or 4. I would go on to say how many disputes are allowed to be sent to the appraiser. I strongly encourage and really strongly urge you to set it at 1 dispute, especially when you're providing additional comps. And the reason I say that is you're going back to the appraisable multiple times with additional comps every time or additional questions. It could certainly have the appearance of appraiser pressure, and that would be a direct violation of an appraiser independence violation. So anyway, so I'm going on to the next bullet point. All revision rebuttal requests should be screened, reviewed by the AMC to make sure they are compliant and reasonable before releasing to the appraiser for consideration. Again, that's where we spoke. We have a quality control or a post-completion quality control department. It's going to read every request that comes through the software system, and obviously we all have different mortgage software systems. And at times the loan officer can send things through. They can request certain values be hit, or this appraiser's terrible. All those things that just need to be reviewed and make sure that anything going to the appraiser is not a violation, is compliant with today's guidelines. And understand, and I think appraisers need to also understand it. Revision rebuttal requests are not necessarily reflective of an inappropriate appraiser pressure. They're often reflect a genuine concern that the appraisal or the appraised value is not credible. And it is the appraiser's job to provide credible results to their appraisal report. And if they're not there, it's okay to go back to the appraiser and have those things corrected. So moving on to the next slide. We're going to talk about some acceptable revision rebuttal requests. Again, requests addressing any observed error or omission in the appraisal report. Obviously, one of the top things that we see all the time is the square footage doesn't match the county records. Again, the county records may be off, but it's definitely something that the borrower is going to see, especially now that they're getting a copy of their appraisal report effective this year. They're going to see everything that comes through, and they're going to be, especially when the value doesn't come in as high as they thought it would be, they're going to start looking through this appraisal report and trying to determine what mistakes the appraiser made. And the square footage thing is typically the one they're going to recognize the first. Obviously, we will send those over to the appraiser and have them provide comments as to how they came up with their square footage. Hopefully, are the appraisers going out and physically measuring the property and showing that in their appraisal report. Another thing we see quite often is no mention of external factors. And this could be both negative and or positive. Obviously, if there's a gas station or a huge manufacturing plant that the underwriter sees on the Google Maps that the appraiser hasn't addressed, that's certainly something that we should go back to the appraiser on and say, hey, why didn't you talk about the gas station or the manufacturing plant that seems to be sitting across the street from the subject property, maybe even a school? Again, those are negative things that need to be addressed, and certainly Fannie and Freddie are going to have their eyes and ears open and looking for things like this in order to send back a repurchase. So it's definitely okay to go back and have the appraiser expand. On the positive side, though, it could be a park or something along that. It could be an actual positive thing that could affect marketability in a positive way that maybe the appraiser didn't mention. So it's okay with the borrower to say, hey, wait a minute, we're in one of the more desirable areas of town because we're in walking distance of all the shopping and restaurants, where there's this huge park that everybody loves to go to. It's okay to go back and ask the appraiser to address that and see if maybe he may have failed to mention that. Again, I'm going on with some more really common revisions that we see. No mention of recent reported upgrades or renovations to the subject property. Obviously, homeowners put a lot of money in their homes and renovating and trying to make their house worth more. And when they don't see that addressed in the appraisal report, such as the new kitchen, the new bath, even possibly something as the new roof and windows, those are expensive items. Again, a lot of times you don't get the value of the cost, but certainly it's something that the borrowers want to see that are recognized. The next thing, missing exhibits, photos, addendums. And again, obviously this is where you go back to your AMC. Hopefully they are actually putting their eyes on every appraisal that comes through the door and making sure these exhibits and photos and the appraisers provided the necessary addendums in their appraisal report before they're even sent to you. Again, because the last thing that the lender needs is to have to go back to the AMC and then back to the appraiser from that point and waste time getting photos and exhibits that should have been included in the beginning. So I would strongly urge any AMC that you have that you look at their quality control staff and see who they employ. You know, are they licensed appraisers that can read through the addendum report and make sure that the appraisers provided credible results. And believe me, I know on the lending side, I remember getting appraisals back that had missing photos, no subject photos, or maybe it was a ranch and the photos provided were 2 stories. Again, those are things that hopefully your QC at your AMC is catching first, so that we're not wasting time from the lender to have to go back. Other examples that we see, and these are obviously a little bit less, but the owner of record doesn't match title. Again, with current UAD and UCDP and Fannie and Freddie, they're wanting the borrowers to match the title. When the lender sees that the title doesn't match, it's imperative that they get that information over to the AMC as quickly as possible so that we can get in touch with the appraiser, have them correct it. That's a very easy correction. It doesn't take much time, or it shouldn't take much time. The next thing that we see quite often, especially in today's world, which is a little bit more of a purchase market as opposed to a refi market, is the changes in purchase contract. Again, those things just happen. Sometimes it's a change in price, it's a renegotiated price, maybe contingencies within the contract, or maybe concessions were changed. But anytime there's a change to the purchase contract, the appraiser is required by USPAP to review and comment on and analyze the purchase contract. So anytime that the lender is made aware of the new contract, we need to get that over to the AMC and then over to the appraiser as quickly as possible. Obviously, if we can do that prior to delivering the appraisal, it's a lot easier than it is after the appraisal has been delivered and completed by the appraiser, because it's after the effective date and the purchase price changes or something in the contract changes. It's going to require the appraiser to go into the addendum, note the new contract and any changes within it, and then provide a new signature date. So again, as quickly as you can get those 2 things over to the AMC, the better it is and the easier it is to get those corrections made by the appraiser. So we'll move on to the next page and talk about a few of the unacceptable, or the, my bad, jumping ahead of page, the acceptable sales when they're providing additional dispute comps or rebuttal comps, I think, or even possibly the reconsiderations of value. It is acceptable for the appraiser to address why certain sales were not used in the report. Again, we touched on this a bit earlier, but there should be an established policy around how many comparable properties are allowed to be presented to the appraiser and how often. Again, 3 to 4 would be my recommendation, no more than 3 or 4 comparable properties, and no more than 1 time going back to the appraiser to consider additional comps. But when you do that, there are certain guidelines you should follow. The sales provided should be as close or closer than the comps in the appraisal. They should be located in the same neighborhood and market area that the subject property is in, and hopefully the same market area that your appraiser used. Sales should be of similar style, size, quality, and condition to the subject property. One of the things we'll see is the subject property is a 1,500 square foot ranch, and the loan officer or the borrower is sending in homes of 2-story style homes that are 3,000 square feet compared to our 1,500 square foot ranch. Obviously, those wouldn't be considered as comparable as probably the sales used on the original appraisal report. Going on, the sales must be arm's length transactions. Using private sales and things that they pulled off of Zillow and things of that nature are going to be very difficult for the appraiser to consider, because he doesn't know the dealing behind that transaction. May not even know the interior conditions and things of that property. So it can be awfully difficult for the appraiser to use something that all that data is not available. Again, another thing that we see quite often is, why didn't the appraiser use this sale? And it happened after the effective date of the appraisal. The sales that are being used have to have closed prior to the effective date of the appraisal. And I just touched on this just a moment ago. The sales must be verifiable through a conventional data source, preferably the MLS. That way the appraiser can see photos, he can get comments from the real estate agent, even make a phone call if necessary to find out the improvements in the terms of that sale. So these are things, whenever you're presenting rebuttal comps to the appraiser for consideration, you need to follow these guidelines. Moving on to the next slide here. Unacceptable revision request. Again, suggestions and adjustments are too high or too low. These are awfully hard to win when you're, or even send over to an appraiser, because they do borderline, possible coercion towards the appraiser to hit something. So Again, requesting an appraiser to apply consistent adjustments with cost, not value. Obviously, like I mentioned before, when you put a pool in a home and it costs $30,000, and the borrower, I'm wondering why the appraiser only adjusted for $5,000. Hopefully the appraiser talked about that need to begin with, but cost doesn't always equal value. And going back to the appraiser and saying you need to give me more value because I spent $30,000, those are awfully difficult assignments to send over, request to send over to the appraiser. Requesting appraiser to overlook certain adjustments such as condition related, whether it be a positive adjustment or no adjustment at all because the subject property had recent renovations, and the borrower saying, wait a minute, he didn't give me credit for my new kitchens and new baths. None of the comps they used had the same things. Again, we can go back to the appraiser and ask him to say, hey, can you verify that the comparable sales had similar renovations? But to suggest that since the borrower put $40,000 into their renovations and the appraiser should adjust, those type of things where you're sending over, those wouldn't be allowed. Believe it or not, we still see this today. It's suggesting a certain value is needed. Providing a suggested adjustment figure and its appraisal should be adjusted by that figure. Again, I just mentioned saying that we just put a $30,000 pool in, please have the appraiser make a proper $30,000 adjustment and raise value. That would not be allowed. Providing a desired, needed appraised value to make the deal work. Again, I hate to say it, but we've seen this recently even at Allstate where a loan officer got one through the software system. Obviously, we didn't allow that to go over to the appraiser, but the request said, as you know, we need the value to be $400,000. Well, no, we don't know that, nor does the appraiser know that, nor will they be allowed to know that. So unbelievable that it still happens in today's world, but it does. And then the last one here is need appraiser to raise value to match purchase price. Obviously, there's a lot of passion behind purchase price appraisals. And when they come in low, there's going to be a lot of red flags and a lot of issues that you're going to have to deal with on the lender side as to why the value didn't come in. But what we can't do is go back to the appraiser and say, hey, wait a minute, we've got a purchase contract here. We've got a willing buyer and a willing seller. You need to raise that value. So we just need to find documentable information that possibly the appraiser missed, maybe some additional sales that the appraiser didn't consider, and just go about it the right way. So we're going to go over a couple examples of a wrong way to ask and a right way to ask revision requests or rebuttals. So the first one here is the wrong way to ask an appraiser to look at something would be the house down the street from the subject property just sold for $400,000. Please have the appraiser add this comp and adjust value. This would be leading the appraiser to a certain value. In this case, $400,000 would be a clear violation of AIG. We wouldn't want to send that. However, the more appropriate way would be to follow your rebuttal or your reconsideration of value process and say, attached is a sale that's sold down the street from the subject property. Please have the appraiser consider this sale. Again, there may be a very good reason. I will tell you 9 out of 10 times there is a good reason why that sale wasn't considered. It was probably considered, or used, I shouldn't say considered, but used by the appraiser. Many times it's because the different style and size. Again, we talked about that before. We're a ranch style of 2,000 square feet, and the appraiser provides, or the borrower or the dispute provides a comp of a 2-story style that's 3,000 square foot compared to our 2,000 square foot ranch 2-story. Another one that we see quite often is it's sold after the effective date of the appraisal. The appraiser can only consider those sales that sold prior to the effective date. Not that he can't consider and shouldn't consider current active and pending sales, but that should all be analyzed prior to. And the appraiser can't change the effective date of the appraisal to consider additional comp. But it is okay to have the appraiser address so that all involved are aware of why the sale was not used. So moving on to the next example would be the borrower has noted recent updates to the kitchen and bath totaling $40,000. Again, we touched on this before. Please have the appraiser adjust accordingly and revise the appraised value to reflect the renovations. Again, this would be steering the appraiser to make a $40,000 adjustment and to raise the value. The more appropriate request would be to say, the borrower has noted some recent updates to their kitchen and bath. Please verify that the appraiser was aware of this and the consideration was given to those upgrades. Again, if applicable. again, it's all about how you ask it. And certainly if the appraisers miss something, we want to get those answered, but we want to go about it in a way that's not going to put the lender and or the AMC at risk of violating any part of AIG. So now I'm going to turn it over to Justin Jennis. He's our operations manager, and he's going to discuss setting up processes and procedures around customer complaints and exclusionary lists. So Justin, here you go.
All right, thanks, Scott. Great information so far, and just wanted to say thanks again to everybody for taking time out of your day to join us on this webinar. As Scott touched on, what I'm going to touch on here are two items that are a big part of what's going on in today's climate, and that's customer complaints and the exclusionary list. So starting here with this slide, one of the things we've noted here is your AMC should have a customer complaint policy that is approved by the lender. And essentially what we're working on here is making sure that the AMC has a policy that's going to be consistent with the expectations of the lending institution, in which case we're looking for the AMC and the lender to be flexible to make sure that the needs of the lender are being met here, because as we're noting in the first bullet point, the appraiser out in the field is both a reflection of the lender and the AMC, and all complaints against the appraiser should be fully investigated. So from our end, an AMC should have dedicated high-level personnel to handle these sensitive situations. For example, we've got operations managers, chief appraisers, vendor or processing manager, somebody that can be a point of contact for the lending institution to reach out and discuss any accusations or observation from the customer. Once the AMC is notified of the accusations, it's up to the AMC to independently research with the vendor of any potential issues, hopefully without alerting them of the complaint that might have taken place during their inspection. If the vendor comes back and notes that the inspection was status quo, the AMC would then advise the vendor of the customer accusations, and from there we would determine if there was merit to the complaint. Many of the complaints that we've actually seen could take place, range in variety from the appraiser's attire at the inspection, showing up in shorts and a t-shirt as opposed to dressing professionally. The inspection might have taken too long or not taken long enough in the eye of the customer. We've seen situations where the appraiser began measuring the home without announcing themselves to the homeowner. Even situations where an appraiser might bring a child or another guest along the inspection with them without letting the customer know beforehand. Some of the more serious infractions we've seen would be that an appraiser would actually send out a trainee without a supervisor. So in situations like that, we'd go on to the next bullet point and note that proper disciplinary action should be taken whenever they're merited or necessary. So if it is discovered that there is merit to the accusations presented by the homeowner, the AMC should certainly discuss potential disciplinary actions that would be appropriate for the infraction. Now, that being said, an appraiser that's going to show up to the house and maybe their attire was not consistent with what the expectations were for the AMC or the lending institution, that appraiser might not be somebody who we would consider right off the bat for an exclusionary list. However, we would certainly want our vendor management team to contact them, discuss the expectations, and set those forth, and also note that appraiser's profile within the system, so that if we were to catch a pattern, that would certainly be something that would be consideration for exclusion. The more serious infraction, like sending an unqualified trainee without a supervisor, that would be a little bit more serious, and we would expect that that appraiser was cut off from any work right away until the AMC had a chance to meet with all the key players, the chief appraiser, the vendor manager, operations manager, and processing quality control manager. And once that situation was investigated, if it was found to be true, that would most likely result in a DNU situation. So from that point, the last bullet point notes that an AMC should provide the lender with a detailed report describing the complaint investigation and the results of any disciplinary action taken. So the final step of the process would be to make sure the lending institution and the AMC have a set protocol in place to document the customer complaint and allow the AMC to notify the lender of the results of the complaint investigation. So if we can move on to the next slide and start talking about exclusionary lists. Here we want to talk about the fact that AMC partners should have a detailed policy and procedure around exclusionary list. This should be handled by your AMC's vendor management team, and that would also include involving those who have a stake in the day-to-day operations to provide some input. So at a minimum, your AMC's vendor management team, along with a set group of high-level management involved with the day-to-day operations, should meet at least monthly to discuss possible additions to the list. So a few things that we've got noted here that we actually look for and would be considered for a potential exclusion onto the exclusionary list or inclusion of our exclusionary list would be appraisers that have violated USPAP. This is a big issue, as generally these are going to result in potential repurchase demands that are going to put the AMC and the lender at risk. Appraisers that fail to meet engagement letter requirements, consistent quality issues from the same appraiser, or appraisers not providing the required necessary level of customer service. So that last one's actually important because a lot of appraisers feel that if their report is clean and that there's no issues within the report, that an AMC cannot consider them for an exclusionary list, which is certainly possible. But if they're consistently missing SLAs or not providing good customer service, they can certainly be excluded. So if anybody from the operations team, the processing, quality control, et cetera, come across any of the above infractions, they should be required to notify vendor management. At that point, the situation will be investigated, and if they feel strongly, the appraiser will be included as part of the discussion for the next DNU meeting. If the infraction is significant, the vendor manager should take action to make sure the vendor is not provided with assignments until the situation can be discussed and a resolution can take place. So if we can go to the next slide. So it's important to note that in all of these situations, the first choice or the plan of action, it's always going to be to attempt to counsel the appraisal vendor to see if there was a situation where the vendor could attempt to make appropriate changes to the report or recognize the expectations of the AMC when completing their appraisal inspections. Unfortunately, from time to time, you do reach an impasse, and it's necessary to remove the vendor from the AMC's panel, and that's to protect both the AMC and the lending institution. The way to go about that would be to notify the appraiser in writing of their change in status, essentially letting them know they're being placed on the exclusionary list, and note in that letter that they have a set amount of days to reply. This is covered in the first bullet point here. Most states have AMC regulations that require the AMC that allows the appraiser at least 30 days to reply. That's consistent with our policy as well. But it is important to note that there are some states that have different requirements, and it's also important for the AMC's compliance department to be cognizant of that, work with their vendor management teams, and adjust their policies accordingly. As far as the second bullet point regarding USPAP errors, again, this is a situation where our first choice is always going to be to counsel the appraiser, making necessary revisions to the appraisal report and try to work together to ensure that we can get the report delivered to the lending institution that's compliant, USPAP compliant, and sent over in a timely manner. But again, that's not always possible. So for their proper reporting to the appropriate state board is required when a USPAP violation occurs, especially in instances where the violation had a material impact on the results of the assignment or the estimated value. And then last but not least, the AMC should provide detailed reports to the lender as requested, detailing any steps that we're taking to either exclude an appraiser from the AMC's vendor panel or reporting of any USPAP errors. Generally, this is done during the lender's annual AMC audit. So that pretty much wraps up my portion here. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So again, I want to thank everybody for taking some time out of your day to meet with us today, and I'll go ahead and send it back over to Scott Sparks.
Great. Thanks, Justin. A lot of good information. I'm sure was beneficial to many of the people on the call. Again, looks like we're already a couple minutes over our time, and I certainly want to be respectful of all of you that have other meetings and other jobs that need to be completed before the end of your day. So what we'll do is any of the questions that are coming over, we'll send out a reply to those questions in a good format that's understandable. Also, just so you know, we will be at the Valuation Expo, Steve and I, for sure. And we have a booth up there, number 16. So stop by and see us. And if you have a question, we'd be certainly open to sitting down and have discussions around some of the common revisions and requests and things, rebuttal requests that you guys are seeing today. We're going to put up our contact information, but again, hopefully, if you're going to be in Vegas next week, definitely stop by our booth. Steve and I would love to meet you and answer any possible questions you might have. So, again, appreciate everybody joining the call today, and have a great rest of your week.